Welcome to the presentation portion of the Senior Comprehensive Class of 2021. We are glad that you have joined us for this presentation by Joshua Shew on the topic of various responsibility when AI malfunctions. We do have some basic rules that we ask you to please observe. Please do not leave early. When the doors are closed for the presentation, as they are now, we ask that no one comes or goes until the presentation is completed. Please help us maintain a respectful atmosphere. Younger siblings are welcome if they can sit quietly for 30 minutes at a time. How you feeling, Elijah? If they begin to fuss, please take them out of the room quietly. This is Shew. Please turn all cell phones off completely. As the assessment is based on Joshua's performance as interaction with the panel, you are asked as the audience not to interact with the panel or with Joshua during the presentation or the collaboration time, question and answer portion afterwards. So thank you for your support with this. Once we're out of the room, then you can feel free to talk and ask questions. Students, please do not plan on staying on campus once you have attended the presentations you've been assigned to. You may not go to ones you are not assigned to. And parents, please do not plan on staying on campus. Well, you have an exception, so that's okay. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for your support with this, and Joshua, the floor is yours.
Awesome. All right. So I can just get started.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Joshua Shew, as Mr. Gibson introduced, and I'm talking about artificial intelligence and how we assign blame. See, my issue is based on this assumption: artificial intelligence will malfunction. Let's take a look at an example of that just from the start. So, let's see, freeze this. This is May 2018 in Arizona. This is an Uber autonomous vehicle that we're testing it. This is Elaine Hertzberg on the left. This is Rafaela Vasquez on the right. This was the first time when an autonomous vehicle killed a pedestrian. That was Elaine Hertzberg. Rafaela Vasquez was in the driver's seat. She was the safety driver, so she was just sitting there, supposed to press the emergency brake if something went wrong. But because they were just doing laps around the same area, it was nighttime, she was just looking at her phone, actually at an episode of The Voice, while the car barreled towards Elaine Hertzberg. The car was actually supposed to pick up a pedestrian, like the sensors are supposed to work, but unfortunately did not for some reason. And of course, Rafael was looking down, did not see, so Elaine Hertzberg unfortunately passed away on the spot. You might have heard about this issue on the news if you were paying attention to tech news in 2018. This was one of the big moments which pushed the issue of artificial intelligence and law into the public sphere. And it was from this that I came to realize that this was an issue. But of course, artificial intelligence is not limited to autonomous vehicles. There's facial ID, facial recognition. There's hiring robots, so robots that kind of pass through a list of applicants and try to determine who's the best candidate. So there's a variety of applications where artificial intelligence is used, and they have the potential to fail in all these circumstances. My presentation tries to answer the question, what do we do when that happens? See, up until I investigated this crash, I was looking into how can we prevent discrimination, for example. If AI, is being used in a certain application, how do we prevent it from going wrong? What I did find was that it required a variety of technological solutions. It wasn't just one thing. If you wanted to prevent discrimination, you needed a more robust set of data. If you wanted to prevent, say, in warfare, problems of responsibility, then you needed a clear chain of command even within the artificial intelligence. There were different technologies. What united these different applications, autonomous cars, facial ID, was the legal structure behind it. See, Uber, in this crash, faced no criminal or civil responsibility. They got away scot-free, and Rafaela Vasquez took the criminal liability for this incident. That, I think, is a miscarriage of justice. So now I'm tackling not the question of how do we prevent autonomous car crashes, how do we prevent discrimination, but when it does happen, who do we blame? This brings me to my proposal. Without context, it might seem a bit weird, but I want to provide artificial intelligence with rights. I want to give artificial intelligence legal personhood. I'll explain that a little bit later. But through this, incorporate them into the legal system and provide a structure where there was none. This probably sounds a bit weird, like rights for artificial intelligence. What does that even mean? Are they even conscious? Are we answering that question? I'm not going into that into this presentation, but I promise you, even without looking into that, there is a way in which the research leads to this conclusion quite clearly. So let me take a step back and go over what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, just establishing some ground terms that I'm calling foundations. So what is artificial intelligence? Legal person here, kind of explaining how artificial intelligence works as it is relevant to my presentation. Then I can go into my issue and why it even exists in the first place. And based on that, here's my proposal a little bit more meaning. AI rights, a bit abstract right now, but through this framework, I think it'll have a bit more meaning. We can explore what that means for the legal system. Of course, given this proposal, have to see how this can actually be implemented, what steps need to be taken to make this a reality. That is the, in action, what does this look like step, and I'll talk about my my project, the Senior Comprehensive project that kind of made this a bit of a reality, contributing to the solution a little bit. And finally, meaning. I'm really excited for this part. This is basically the Christian theology, the Christian perspective section, but I think it provides meaning to the reasoning for why this is an issue in the first place, the cause, and of course, in a different way, provides additional meaning to the proposal. See, thus far, I'm not really referencing Christian theology, but it's sound even without it, but with it, it gains deeper meaning. So, let's dive right in. You can expect these points a little bit later, so let's just get into the foundation. Artificial intelligence. You might have preconceptions of what this means already, so let me just start with a ground state easy definition. This is the ability of a digital computer to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent beings. This is from the Britannica Encyclopedia. It's a very simple definition, and this covers a wide range of abilities. So you have, for example, you're sitting in a room, and your room has a heater. If it gets too cold, the heater turns on. If it gets too hot, it detects that heater turns on. That is very simple artificial intelligence. It can be written with a few lines of code, and in this program, you would know. But this is technically artificial intelligence. It mimics how a human would react to the temperature, press the button, react to the temperature, turn it off, that sort of thing. It also stretches from this very simple instance to the most complex forms of artificial intelligence as well. So this is the artificial intelligence that beat the best chess player, the best Go player. The artificial intelligence that's used in social media to customize your feed so you stay on as long as possible. All of this artificial intelligence, computers being used to mimic human intelligence so that they are applicable in a variety of different circumstances. But we still need to understand why it works. And I'm going to explain only the parts that are really relevant to this presentation. So artificial intelligence, through the previous definition, can be achieved in a variety of ways. So you can do just like simple if-else clauses, like if we detect this scenario, then we do this. If we detect this, then do this. But the more complex and pretty much the standard method of achieving artificial intelligence in more complex scenarios is what we call a neural net. This is meant to simulate your brain just a little bit. Take, for example, this is trying to determine auditory input and determine if it was say the word go or the word stop, right? So say this is auditory input for a certain frequency, auditory input for another frequency. If this was your ear, you would have auditory input going in, hitting the nerve, which would then release chemicals which are connected to a whole host of nerves connected to it, like hundreds of cells, nerve cells. This creates a chain reaction based on the specific configuration and types of nerve cells surrounding it, which eventually leads to your brain interpreting it as a certain word. It's rather complicated, but this is basically the computer imitation of that. You have input nodes right here. You have kind of the hidden layer. So this would be like your ears. This would be the path from your ears to the part of your brain that recognizes that it's a certain word. And then this whole chain of nerves, these nerves, make the interpretation that you've heard a certain word. The key here is that this gets very complicated. This is like the simplest example. This could barely solve like looking at a handwritten word and trying to see what letter it is. On the other hand, if you're trying to determine auditory input, it takes hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, even up to 1 million nodes with all of these lines connected, which are basically just like calculations being made to achieve a certain output. Why this is relevant is because it obscures responsibility. Say you want to determine why did it say that the input was go. you would have to trace back every single line and see why was this node this way, and then go back to input. What input did we get here? This is impossible if you have millions and millions of nodes, which is why artificial intelligence complicates the legal system. So this is the neural net. The main aspect is it's complicated and it's hard to determine why a certain action happened. It enables us to do things that we couldn't do before, but it comes at the cost of a lack of transparency. Okay, let's get into the next thing. Legal person. So this is what the vocabulary I used. I wanted to consider artificial intelligence, give it legal personhood. What this means in the legal system is it refers to a human or just any entity that is treated as a person for limited legal purposes. And the legal jargon is actually quite boring. It just means you can sue, you can hold currency, you can enter contracts, for example. So humans, by default, are legal persons. You also have corporations, business partnerships. All of these are legal persons, legal personhood, because they can be sued. They're incorporated into the legal system. And it gives it a structure, like a smooth structure, so this allows Uber as a corporation to be sued instead of just the individual CEO, right? So understanding those two terms, I just wanted to move into a more comprehensive and deep understanding of this issue. So I gave a kind of a broad example through the Uber case, but let me provide a more academic standpoint for why this is an issue. So this is Stuart Russell. He's a prominent AI researcher, and he and a number of co-authors published in 2015 the AI open letter. If you pay attention to tech news at all in 2015, this was huge. It also had a number of other signatories like Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and it basically pushed ripples through the public sphere, kind of similar to the Uber case. It caused a lot of discussion. But the paper behind it was comprehensive, and what it identified for autonomous vehicles was the legal framework for determining who was right, who was wrong, was lacking. And this was proven 3 years later with the Uber case. The same shortcomings were identified in this paper for hiring bots, preventing discrimination, in usage in warfare. All of these systems, the paper recommended different technological solutions, which made my initial search for how am I going to solve this problem very difficult. But they were united by the fact that they didn't have a clear legal solution. There was no legal structure behind this to determine who was right and wrong, for example. So what do we have instead? We don't have a legal structure. What has humanity created to benefit us? This is Brent Middlestadt. He is also an AI researcher working at Oxford, and he analyzed AI ethics guidelines. These are guidelines published by private corporations, companies, also by small local governments, and also by national governments, essentially outlining when we interact with artificial intelligence, what are we going to do? Common things are like, we're going to be transparent, we're going to be human-centric, for example. But the problem that Brent Middlestadt outlined is that there is some commonality, but all of this is legally just like irrelevant. You sue someone for trouble, this ethics guideline is totally irrelevant because it's non-binding. So Brent Middlestadt's argument with his paper was that ethics guidelines are good. They're indicative of a public that is aware about the issue, or at least want to show that. Companies want to show that they are aware about this issue, but they are not tackling the root problem. There's nothing being done to solve the legal problem. So how did this apply in the Uber case? As I outlined previously, so Uber was not criminally liable. They were not liable in civil court. They were essentially scot-free for this incident. Even though the National Transportation Safety Board, in a report, published that Uber's policies did in fact contribute to the incident. Of course, this external public moral recognition of responsibility is different from a legal sense of assigning blame, which is important as well. We need the legal structure to mirror our moral sense of what is right and wrong. This case showed that it wasn't being achieved, and it loops back to the AI system is too complicated, and there wasn't a clear way of determining who is responsible. But you can imagine with decades of artificial intelligence development and the legal system kind of adapting to that, you would achieve a state where we can actually solve this issue. So let me look into why this came into existence. I've outlined 3 causes for this current issue, and 2 of them are actually quite closely linked: economic incentive and inflexible policy. So The economic incentive has been well documented by a number of researchers. Essentially, it's the fact that artificial intelligence makes jobs simpler, makes it cheaper to do. So there's huge incentive on the researcher side for the private corporations to develop artificial intelligence quickly and effectively at solving limited problems. What this doesn't mean is that policy is going to adapt at that same rate. Policy is adapting only at the rate at which companies need like a loophole so that we can use artificial intelligence in contracts, for example. So when Amazon wants to set up a bartering system between artificial intelligence recommending products to a customer, that's technically a violation of the AI's inability to enter contracts. But there's a little bit of a loophole in which they can get through that. So that's the way in which the legal system adapted. Not by restructuring the system in a positive way, but just restructuring it so that there's limited, limited loopholes possible so that companies can get a profit, right? So it's small progress on the legal front. In fact, not even progress, just regression. And economic incentives for rapid development. The legal system is currently just ill-prepared to deal with large-scale problems. And now we get to the interesting part. This is the culture of transparency. You would think that the research sphere, at the very least, would be contributing to the solution. But what happened in the decade prior to now, so the current decade I see as being quite positive progress, but before that, caught up in a culture of transparency. What does that mean? This is what Joshua Kroll in his paper comments on. But transparency is not the solution. So far, policies have been saying, okay, so if something wrong happens with artificial intelligence, then just publish the code to the legal, like the courts. They can review, determine what went wrong, and then blame the relevant parties. What Joshua Kroll commented is that with recent artificial systems, there's no way, even with the code and 100 years of determining exactly what happened, just because of the computational complexity. So there's a technological limit to transparency. Just giving the source code doesn't solve the problem. What this means is that the research sphere was pushing a solution that does not work. And at the same time the AI was progressing, legal sphere was adapting a little bit to this culture of transparency by requiring source code to be released, but it didn't help at all. So now we're stuck. We have transparency, but it doesn't mean anything. And we have artificial intelligence that's complicated enough to make this a problem. The legal system isn't prepared. How can we solve all of this? That is what my proposal tries to solve. Getting to the roots of this issue and making it kind of a comprehensive solution. So let's revisit what I mentioned in the beginning. Provide AI, provided they can demonstrate intention, with legal personhood. So now I've qualified it a little bit. Let's look at the qualification. See, this is Dr. Roberto Legaspi. He was an AI researcher working at KDDI that I interviewed regarding his papers, which connected agency with artificial intelligence. What does this mean? He comes up with a model, the VDI model of agency. This is used to map agency in humans as well. You have beliefs about how the world works, you have desires for how it should be, and based on your beliefs about how the world works, like if I do A, then B, and your desired state is B, then you would do A, and that becomes your intention. This is kind of a simple psychological model for agency. Roberto Legaspi and a number of other researchers working at private institutions, Stanford, are working on adapting this sense of agency for artificial agents. This is significant because if artificial intelligence can demonstrate agency, then they have the criteria for legal personhood. See, in law, there's not really a clear outline. If an institution can demonstrate this quality, then they become a legal person. But what has been a commonality across all cultures is intention. A human can demonstrate intention. A corporation can demonstrate intention because it's a collection of people coming together and meeting. If artificial intelligence can demonstrate through human language that they have beliefs about how the world works. If I do this, they have a model for the word. If I do A, then B happens. If I do C, then D happens. If you have desires, which Roberto Legaspi is working a way of aligning those with human values, incredibly important. But if they can communicate their desires, which, taking these in combination, translate it into intention, which they can communicate through the human language to us, then they meet the criteria for legal personhood. So what does the world look like if AI, with intention, has legal personhood? It simplifies the process of assigning blame on all fronts. Let me explain why. I was stuck trying to solve this issue for so long, and when this was revealed to me, it's just like mind blown. All right? If a human commits a crime, then what do? You go to court, and depending on the severity and the intention, the motivation, you limit their freedoms, right? So say you assaulted someone. Then you would go to court, and you have potential for jail time. You're limiting your freedom for movement, for communication, right? In a similar way, if you give artificial intelligence, they already have these rights. They already operate in the world. If you label them as rights, say for example, the right for sensory input, the right to exert influence upon the world, like say by hiring an algorithm actually doing its job, the right to hold currency, if they're a trading robot, right? Then you can take those away as a form of punishment and correction. In fact, artificial intelligence works a little bit more elegantly on this front. With humans, say in the case of driving, you make a mistake and you get a ticket. You have the potential to require mandatory classes because of that infraction, which basically is the legal system trying to correct your brain so you become a better driver. In the case of artificial intelligence, this is very simple because you can just take it back in for 3 months, give it more data to feed on, and it becomes a better system, right? So this gives a simple framework by which incorporating artificial intelligence into the current system for punishment, for humans, for corporations, this already exists. If we put AI into it, it's very simple to identify what went wrong and what do we do. We don't have to create a new framework for how we can punish AI, how we can determine who exactly is responsible. We just have to go, this artificial intelligence requires review. It requires a limitation of its freedoms in a certain way, and if it is so severe, such as perhaps in the case of the Uber crash, and if that Uber autonomous artificial intelligence demonstrated intention, then you could terminate it. Say anything associated with this went terribly wrong, we have to stop it. This is what you can do if you incorporate artificial intelligence into the framework of legal personhood. You don't need loopholes, you don't need exceptions, you just need to map human punishment onto AI. It's so much simpler. Of course, there's an important clarification, and there's also a simple solution for this as well. If AI is not volitional, if they don't have this capacity to demonstrate intention, then you have to map out who is responsible. But the exact technology that Roberto Legaspi is proposing, that Joshua A. Kroll is saying is necessary, is what enables you to determine who is responsible instead of just looking at transparency. So we already have transparency. That is in fact good, but you need technologies that are able to peer into the artificial intelligence and determine who's responsible. So our bare bones version of this framework maybe just is able to communicate its intention and some bare bones reasoning for that. This is enough to perhaps implicate a person instead of punishing an AI that is able to demonstrate all this. If the AI isn't able to demonstrate all this, at a minimum, if it is complex enough to cause a problem, then it needs to be able to communicate this. And through that, even if it doesn't have a clear set of the whole BDI model intention, you can still figure out who's responsible. So this solution kind of covers both fronts. When artificial intelligence is intelligent enough to have intention, then you can incorporate them into the legal framework. Otherwise, then it functions just like a autonomous vehicle. Like you determine exactly who is responsible, the programmer or the legal framework that caused this to happen, and then you can punish that. This technological and legal solution is an elegant way to solve this problem of the culture of transparency. You utilize that as a benefit instead, and you also solve the problem of a variety of different legal, complicated exceptions and loopholes, simplified under legal personhood. So, how can we actually implement this? It might seem difficult to actually have a comprehensive way of implementing AI into legal personhood, and that is why I bring up a current proposal by the European Union. It was proposed in January and currently under revision, but it aims to consolidate all of these various loopholes and whatnot under a more comprehensive and cohesive framework. What it does not do is incorporate AI, provide them to a way to have legal personhood. So that is kind of the next step. But what this does show is that there is a way forward to consolidate policy. There is a need for that, and there's already incentives in politics to consolidate this framework. So what do we need to motivate the politicians to make a legal person for AI reality? Here I reference another psychological study and framework for human behavior. So this was referenced in a study considering pro-environmental behavior among high school students. This is the theory of planned behavior. It's based upon your attitude towards an issue, your subjective norms. So this is a good thing to do, this is a bad thing to do. And finally, your beliefs about agency. So I have the capacity to create change in this front. In the case of environmental behavior, the researchers identified that we already have a positive attitude. We know what is right. We just, students in this case, it was an analysis of high schoolers, just don't think that they can actually cause change. So to motivate environmental behavior, you want to make them feel like they can cause change. Like your action actually causes a difference. It's research based. Then they are motivated to cause change. So it helps you identify with an issue where you need to put pressure to cause change. So now I look into artificial intelligence. So there's another study by this is researcher Lima and various others published in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence. But this paper identified the views of artificial intelligence and found that they're very malleable. Reference to artificial intelligence should have rights. First of all, people are kind of middle of the lane, or perhaps leaning towards maybe AI shouldn't have rights initially. But given a simple intervention, such as just one simple phrase, like AI or corporations are considered as legal persons, then there are, in a statistically significant matter, more likely to say that artificial intelligence should have rights. What this shows is that there is key subjective norms missing in our public conception of artificial intelligence and rights. So it shows to me, through this theory of planned behavior, that if I can change the subjective norms, which is, simple terms, just raise awareness, like what is true about the scenario, then I can actually change human behavior so that eventually it reaches the politicians. So that is precisely what I propose happens at the local scale, and that's something that I've identified and implemented myself. And so this brings me to my project. This is what I did with sophomores. It was a really fun project. Essentially, it's a bit messy, but let me just kind of show. It was a simulation regarding the Uber case, which I tried to make, regarding the Uber case, which I made into simulation, so they could see the complexities associated with the scenario. So I made a kind of a sheet of the 4 different parties. Uber, the city, state government, they had initially invited Uber in, and now didn't want to get too much flack for the incident that occurred, so they want to get away with less blame. The safety board, which wants to identify truth, and the victim's family, which wants change, and of course, compensation. So I assigned students to each of these parties. I gave them a basic numbered outline of, so what do you want, right? So you get negative points if this happens, negative positive points if this happens. And then they basically discussed all these different points and kind of argued back and forth about what matters. So is Uber criminally liable? Is Rafaela Vasquez, the safety driver, criminally liable? Is Uber allowed to continue testing? And they spent about 25, 30 minutes discussing this back and forth, and it finally came together in a huge heated debate about what we're gonna do. What this showed is this framework was very effective in getting engagement, which is precisely what I needed for them to see the complexity of the issue. Why, without a legal framework, there was a problem. See, if there was a legal framework, as I presented immediately after, then you wouldn't have to have 4 parties involved. You would just have to have Uber, Rafaela, and the courts. But because of the lack of legal framework, it was a 30-minute discussion, it was a heated debate about what exactly should happen. So in this way, I was able to show the subjective norms in a really visual and vivid way that there was problems with the current system. So now I want to dig into, on all these fronts, the issue, why it matters, and the proposal, what the Christian perspective has to say. So, first of all, there is a theme of justice in the Bible. And the reason why this matters, as I'm referencing Scott B. Ray's book on Christian theology here, that all goodness, that the standard for good is based on God's character, according to Christian theology. So what is God's character? Here I reference, in relation to justice, the Old Testament, the story of the Old Testament. It's a consistent case. From the beginning, God is saying, this is right, this is wrong. And then again, Tower of Babel, this is right, this is wrong. Again, revealing what a just society looks like through laws, through essentially what today is like regulation. If this happens, then this is the punishment. God cares about justice consistently. And that reveals that when there is injustice, that is incredibly important to God. So when I initially revealed in the introduction that Uber was not criminally liable, was not found to be criminally liable, this was an injustice. And the reason why this matters beyond the secular perspective is because justice is aligned with God's character and therefore matters. So then, how do we look at the solution? Now I reference harmony in our lectures at CAJ, also referenced as shalom. It's the idea that there is a sense of right relationships between all things within the Christian theology. So here I reference Phillips and Oakholm's book, Welcome to the Family, and they state that God has intended relationships for how humans relate to God, relate to others, relate to nature, and relate to themselves. And I think this also dictates how society should be structured, so that humans are interacting with others and with nature, and now with artificial intelligence, in a way that God intends, a harmonious way. And the proposal that I'm putting forth, that AI should be incorporated into the legal system through legal personhood, is exactly the elegant solution that allows for harmony. Instead of patchwork, instead of loopholes, you have a simple framework of aligning what we've already discovered through thousands of years. What is morality for humans? You just have to apply that to artificial intelligence. This is harmony. All right, let me take it a step back. So to review, it was May 2018. Elaine Hertzberg was walking across the street, and Rafaela Vasquez in the safety driver's seat of an Uber autonomous vehicle crashed into Elaine Hertzberg, and Elaine Hertzberg passed away. Initially, I said that Uber was not found responsible in any way. This is true in the courts, but fortunately, in this case, there was some sense of justice. So the city had initially invited Uber in, and they were kicked out because this is an extrajudicial process, but they were still kind of punished for what had happened. Furthermore, they were prevented from testing from any other city in the United States for at least 9 months. Again, extrajudicial, but still a sense of justice. Furthermore, the civil case for Uber and the family did not go through, but they reached a settlement a number of months ago, undisclosed amount, but we can assume that there was some compensation, some sense of justice for the family, for their loss. This gives me hope that humans, we see an injustice and we try to reach justice, just like in this case. But we need structure to achieve this consistently. This is what the legal framework I'm proposing is supposed to achieve. We already have an inclination towards justice, but how can we achieve that consistently? We need structure. I think through this structure, we can achieve that harmonious relationship between artificial intelligence, society, and individuals that prepares us for current AI and the future. Thank you for your time. Now I'd like to pass it on to the panel for question and answers.
Great. Thank you. So one question I had, so you were talking a little bit about economic incentives being a factor for why this may be an issue. And I'm curious, how do malfunctions in artificial intelligence affect the market? Because I would assume that it maybe changed the incentive structure, or maybe it's just considered to be an anomaly or a blip, but what have you found in your research?
Yeah, so preventing malfunctions that appear in the public sphere is incredibly important for companies. So what has been identified is companies do test their artificial intelligence for certain edge cases so that these mistakes don't happen. So there is some incentive for proper maintenance and care. On the other hand, this is not complete because they can get away with a little bit, and the little bit is what matters. There's still problems surfacing. So it is true that there is economic incentive for making sure these malfunctions don't happen, but it does not outweigh the overwhelming incentive for perhaps replacing human workers or augmenting their abilities through artificial intelligence. I hope that answers your question. If there's even just like simple points earlier on, or just like something on the slide that you were confused about, I'm willing to go back to that as well.
Yeah, I'm curious to know more about what you did with the sophomore and how, I mean, couldn't really follow everything that you did. Can you explain a little more of the project and if you can share what their reaction was after having that heated discussion and all that.
So, I mean, one thing I didn't share is I came to this because Mr. Kella used this in his world history class for the Treaty of Versailles, which is after World War I, U.S., France, Britain come together and try to determine how badly are we going to bully Germany and other really good territories. But this is like always an engaged discussion. We take like 3 class periods to get through it, and the students love it. I loved it. So I knew that this had some potential, which is why I kind of settled on this and spent like hours making briefing sheets for each one and getting articles ready. The class reaction. So what I actually did, let's see, maybe I can find. Yeah. So I created a survey based on the theory of planned behavior and the actual survey that was sent out in the Lima et al. Study that I referenced earlier that kind of determined AI perspectives in the public. So I made a survey based on that, and I used that at the beginning and the end of the activity to determine how the perspective changed. So I kind of tested their feelings regarding statements such as, I'm confident in my knowledge about artificial intelligence as it relates to the legal system. I understand what artificial intelligence is. I feel comfortable talking to people about what this means. And on all these fronts, from the opening to closing survey, their points improved significantly. Of course, the survey targeted various aspects, like I talked about the theory of planned behavior. There was attitude, subjective norm, and sense of agency. So of course, this one was increased the most, but it actually affected the sides as well. So in a quantitative sense, there was a positive response. But most significantly for me, I loved seeing the students just like get into it from the start. Actually, Sun was there, eh? Yeah. And like from the beginning, I was a bit worried, but I just provided them articles, and they saw that there's a game and you could get points, and they just dug in. And the discussions were wonderful. Like the family was like, what was it? You killed my wife, you know? Like, I deserve justice. And Uber was like kind of being sleazy, like, actually, technically, we're not responsible. I just loved the engagement I got from them. So I think they learned a lot. Yeah.
So one thing, just to clarify, because this was something that, as I was reading the paper, I just hadn't thought much about how the culture of transparency might either not be an effective solution or might actually contribute to the problem. And so my understanding is that it's the fact that when you give when you make something open source, when you make codes open source, the code may be so complex that it's not going to mean anything to anybody who might review it. Is that kind of the reason why culture of transparency isn't effective?
Precisely. And I guess it's important to understand that that's precisely why it's not effective. The code is so complicated that even with just all the time in the world, you can't test every single scenario. Furthermore, the reason why this is so complicated, it's not a problem with traditional code. Code is called references code 1.0, programming 1.0. This is like if-else statements. It's basically everything that I've interacted with as a programmer for the robotics team, just like, if this happens, then do this. If this happens, then do this. This type of programming 2.0, the thing that generates neural nets, is far more complicated because you have code that then generates the net. So you have rather simple code that is able to generate a complicated net, and the complicated net is difficult to peer into. So you can reference the code, but you can't peer into that black box of a million nodes. Does That's precisely why transparency is an inadequate solution. Yeah.
Another question I had was,
Yeah.
so if legal personhood is
Yes.
granted to artificial intelligence in the instances when it's volitional, and something does happen, and there is a trial. So one comparison that you made, I know you made it in the paper, you may have made it in the presentation too, was to corporations and companies having legal personhood.
Yeah.
Well, if a company or a corporation is on trial, oftentimes it's the CFO or the president who stands in the trial and speaks for the company. Who would stand in court and speak for the AI? Would it be whoever has the patent or the copyright? Like who would it be in that case?
Yeah, it would be. This is currently in theory, so it's not well defined. There's not really a case of this actually going through with artificial intelligence, but I can tell you about the framework that have been proposed in the papers. So one proposed solution is that, let's see, Joshua April was saying that transparency is insufficient and instead opposes the advancement in technology that allows for artificial intelligence to be peered into. Those neural nets I was telling you about that are super complicated. A way of interpreting that, perhaps with the use of other artificial intelligence. So these are solutions that like MIT is working on in collaboration with IBM. You might know IBM from Watson. But these technologies, the people that harness these technologies, perhaps the attorneys relevant to that would be the ones representing, kind of like translating the artificial intelligence. Because the artificial intelligence will be able to communicate its intention, belief, and the desires on its own through human language. It just needs the technology to be able to do that. So perhaps like the programmers relevant would be there as well, but that's kind of the framework, the interpreter and the artificial intelligence. Yeah.
So if they can't demonstrate the intention, then the programmers would be.
Yeah. So then we would revert back to the situation where the artificial intelligence does not have rights, therefore cannot be punished. And then you have to trace back through the neural net. I guess I have like cool things. You have to kind of like trace it back all the way to why did this happen, who was responsible, what company architecture, what policies led to this pattern, which led to the incident. So what this could potentially require is that AI of sufficient complexity must have the ability to describe its intention in human language, right? If the artificial intelligence cannot be peered into, if it's a black box that's hard to determine without this like BDI model of determining intention, then you need to have that BDI model to determine who is responsible. Yeah. And so there will be a cutoff point regulation around that. It's a bit tricky.
You said that the EU is taking steps to develop a legal framework. Are there any other places that are moving forward on this or are thinking in these terms?
There's nothing so significant in the legal front that I've come across that tries to unify all these issues. So there's of course researchers. There's research conferences trying to find solutions to this. So for example, there's the Similar Principles by the Future of Life Institute, which is the same institute that published the 2015 AI Open Letter, but essentially tries to consolidate and makes recommendations regarding policy. But on the legal front, it's really just really recently, in January, the EU making this effort to consolidate. Of course, countries are trying to target these, like there's testing for autonomous vehicles going on. There's facial recognition used in the police force. So they're making regulations regarding these individual points separately, which sometimes is questionable. I don't know if you know Joy Giuliani's work recently, starring in a Netflix documentary, Code of Bias. But so there's some questions regarding this regulation as well. But there's efforts being made to do regulation. It's just not cohesive. It's not elegant. It's not bringing all of it together. So it's still disconnected. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And so what do you see as being maybe the main obstacle to, like, for the sake of example, if the U.S. was going to try and move in this direction, what do you see as being some of the biggest?
There is a moral argument. I hinted at in the beginning, asking the question, do we need to consider if AI is conscious to to consider them as legal persons, because the research literature that opposes my perspective, the perspective that comes through the research that I've referenced, is that AI should not be implicated unless it is just wholly independent of human intervention, because AI is not conscious. We have to answer the question of whether AI is conscious to determine whether they should be considered as legal persons. Which the critique to that is that companies already are considered as legal persons, kind of separate from human consciousness, kind of an emergent consciousness, so to speak. But yeah, that is the obstacle. That there is a significant legal literature is that we cannot incorporate AI because it's not conscious. Punishing it is meaningless. Yeah. Any other questions?
No.
I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you so much, the panel and the audience, for attending.